Here's a series of TV ads from the 1970s.
My broker says that with 2 children to put through college, I should start investing in stocks. What does your broker say?
Well, Frank, my broker's E.F. Hutton. And E.F. Hutton says,
when E.F. Hutton talks, people listen.
Some of you remember that whole series throughout the whole 1970s. That broker ran that series of ads. And partly because of that and partly for a few other reasons, E.F. Hutton became the second largest brokerage firm in North America. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, through a series of bad investments and actually some money laundering, the company collapsed under the weight of all of that. But E.F. Hutton, the name E.F. Hutton was so influential that it's been bought by other investment companies over the years, and today it's still out there. You can get online and look up E.F. Hutton, and there's a national brokerage firm with that name today because of the kind of influence that they had even back almost 50 years ago. They had that kind of respect. God should have that kind of respect. So when God talks, people listen. Unfortunately, I had to say it this way: when God talks, people should listen, because it's not always true, is it? But God should have that kind of respect. When he talks, people listen. Today I want to tell you a story of one young man who did listen. And that young man's name was Samuel. The same Samuel we've studied the last 2 weeks together. We looked at his birth 2 weeks ago, and we looked at his early growth last week. And today we want to see when God comes to him and calls him. This is kind of a famous story. It's one of the more famous ones in this book called Samuel. It's not the most famous one. That probably belongs to David and Goliath. But one of the more famous stories in this book. And it's one that is often told in children's church. But for today, we want to move it out of children's church and bring it into the adult service because it has a lot to teach us as adults as well as it has to teach the children. And so we're going to be in 1 Samuel chapter 3 today as a part of this series. Some of you probably saw what my daughter posted online on Groundhog Day. It said something like, if your pastor sees his shadow, there'll be 6 weeks of this sermon series. And my response was, well, in this case, it's a big book. It's going to be at least 16 more weeks of this series. We're in this really long series because this is a very big book. But it's so full of such great stories that I don't think it's ever going to get tiring. But this is one of the famous ones that's in it. So you want to take your Bibles and turn to 1 Samuel chapter 3. As I've been doing in this series, I'm not going to read this whole passage. It's way too long. But I will be walking through it and referring to it often. To understand what happens in 1 Samuel chapter 3, you need to put it in its context, which is 1 Samuel chapter 2. And that's what we looked at last week. We looked in chapter 2 at a comparison-contrast cycle. And this cycle that repeated a number of times in chapter 2. It was a comparison and contrast between Eli's sons and this boy named Samuel. Now, Eli was the priest at Shiloh where Samuel was living. There was some sort of tabernacle or temple there. It's where the Ark of God was kept. We aren't too sure what they kept it in at this stage of time. But there was some sort of location there where they had it, and that's where Eli was ministering. He may have been the high priest of Israel. I told you last week that the language indicates that, but it never says that. And so we don't really know. But he was the priest there, and his sons were described as worthless men who didn't know the Lord. Worthless men who didn't know the Lord. And if you were with us last week or listened or saw the message, you'll know that there's a fascinating word study with that word worthless. And I had fun with that word study, and we talked a lot about it last week. I'd encourage you to go back and see that because it was interesting to me. And there's Eli's sons who are worthless, but the contrast to that is this young Samuel who ministered to the Lord. He was doing what they as young priests should have been doing, and they weren't. In fact, there are 3 cycles in that chapter that we talked about last week. In the first cycle, Eli's sons are called out for their liturgical sins. Now, what I mean by that is they were abusing their privilege as priests. They were abusing their duties as priests and taking advantage of the people who would come to them. And the contrast to that with Samuel, it says he ministered to the Lord. And then there's a second cycle where it points out not the liturgical sins of Eli's sons, but their moral sins. They had some moral issues, and they were sinning against the Lord in that way. And the contrast to that is Samuel, who grew in favor with the Lord and with men. And then there's the beginning of a third cycle where a prophet comes and speaks to Eli and says, your sons are going to die because they're blaspheming me, because they're holding my laws in contempt. And I'm going to raise up another. And that's where the chapter ends. There isn't a contrast to that in chapter 2, but that's because the contrast comes in chapter 3. In fact, chapter 3 begins with these words, now the boy Samuel. It's a very abrupt change, and it's exactly what we saw. In fact, these are the same words that are in chapter 2, verse 26. And it was a very abrupt change in. It's describing Eli's sons, and it abruptly switches to Samuel. There's no transition. There's no segue of any kind. It's just suddenly here's Samuel as a contrast. It did the same thing in that chapter in verse 18. Samuel ministered to the Lord. There's that abrupt change to show the contrast. And you have to remember that in the original language this was written in, there weren't chapter breaks. And so there wasn't a chapter here, and there's this abrupt change, and it's showing that this is the comparison, the contrast of cycle 3, is what's in all of chapter 3, is the contrast to the fact that God came and said, these young men are going to die, and I'm going to raise up another. Samuel is the first fulfillment of that prophecy. And I say the first fulfillment because last week we pointed out that Jesus is the ultimate fulfillment of what is said here. But Samuel is the immediate and first fulfillment of that prophecy. Now, Samuel's described as a boy. Some of your translations say young man. We don't know how old he was. This was a fascinating study to do, but it led pretty much nowhere. And so, in fact, it was interesting because I was reading this in a Bible I have at home, and it was an English Standard Version, the same one I'm reading today, and it said the young man Samuel. And I go, wait a minute, that's not what that said. And I pulled out the one I had on my desk and later, and it says the boy Samuel. And the ESV, when it was first released in I think 2011, they waited a couple years and they got feedback from a number of Bible scholars and pastors and so on, and they made some changes throughout the book, some minor ones. Well, here was one of them. They changed it from young man to boy. Now, I don't know why they decided to do that. The word has a broad range of meaning. In fact, you can find it applied to an infant, and you can find it applied to a very old servant. And so it has a really broad range of meaning. Most often, it means something between a child who is weaned and early manhood, early adulthood. That's usually where it is, but that's still a pretty big range, so we really don't know much about how old Samuel was. If you want to see an interesting use of this word, go back to chapter 1. When Hannah brought Samuel into Eli and left him there, it says, now the boy was young in our translations. What it says in there is the boy was a boy. The word is repeated. The boy was a boy. And so, again, we don't know a whole lot. We know at that point he had just barely been weaned, and in that culture, probably 3 years old or maybe 4. And so that's how old he was. We do know that a lot of time has passed. A number of years have passed since then. And the reason we know that is because we read last week that his mother Hannah used to bring him a new robe every year. A new robe every year. And so a number of years have passed in order for that to be reported. We also know a number of years have passed because this tells us that in verse 2 that Eli's eyesight had grown dim because of his age. And that wasn't the case when Samuel was brought to him. And so he has aged significantly. And so we know that he's getting older. In fact, we read in verse 3 here that Samuel was pretty much doing Eli's job, because one of the jobs of the priests was to keep the lamps in the temple burning. They had to keep the oil in them so they burned all night long. And Samuel was the one doing that job, probably because Eli couldn't see well enough to get up in the night and make sure those things were working and give them oil if they needed it. In fact, that's a little hint at when this event took place, because the author says the lamps had not yet gone out. So it's not sunrise yet because they need the lamps to keep burning, but it's probably close to that, or that comment wouldn't make any sense. And so that's what's going on here. But I think what's happening is that the author is preparing the reader that something big is going to happen. Remember, we just read that Eli and his sons are going to pass away, and God's going to give that job, that position, to someone else. We just read that, and then suddenly here's Samuel introduced, and the next thing he says is the word of the Lord was rare in those days. God was not appearing to people. There weren't any active prophets. And when you read that, and when you realize that Eli's getting very old, the reader's saying something significant is about to happen here. And I think the reader is building up, the writer is building up the reader for that. And what follows then is this famous story of Samuel's calling. It's in verses 4 through 10. Here, it's the part of the story that makes such a great children's story. The key word of this whole section is call or calling. In fact, if you count, you'll find it 11 times in 7 verses. So it's a very word that's used a whole bunch. It is the key word of the whole section. And like our English word call, it has a broad range of meanings. I wondered about the English word call, and I looked up in my big dictionary. I have one of those great big fat dictionaries that's about this fat and huge. And I looked it up, and it took 2 full columns to define the word call in English. 69 different definitions in that article on the word call. So call has an extremely broad range of meaning, and it had a pretty broad range of meaning in those days too. In Hebrew, for instance, it could mean to name something. When that parade of animals came through and Adam gave them a name, it says whatever Adam would call the animal, that was its name. And so it has that meaning. It has the meaning of cry out. Someone calls to the Lord. They're crying out for help. It has the meaning of invite. You call someone so they can come to you for some reason. And it can have the meaning of getting one's attention. You call someone to get their attention. By the way, it doesn't mean getting on the phone like it does in English, so just in case you were wondering. The last 2 that I gave you are probably what's intended here, that God is calling out to get Samuel's attention, and then he's inviting him to a specific job that he has for him. And that's probably the meaning that is given here. It says in the midst of this, there's 3 cycles here, or 4 actually, where God calls Samuel. He gets up, he goes to Eli, he says, "You called me," and Eli says, "I didn't call you, go back to bed." There's cycles of this, and there's 3 of them before the last one, which is different. And in these cycles, after 2 cycles, it makes an interesting phrase. It says, Samuel didn't yet know the Lord. Now, that's kind of a striking sentence, because last week we pointed out how it was Eli's sons who didn't know the Lord, and Samuel was the contrast to that. And so the implication is Samuel did have a relationship with the Lord. We saw in chapter 1 how when his mother left him in the temple, he went and he worshiped the Lord. And so it seems that Samuel has a personal relationship, and yet suddenly it says Samuel didn't know the Lord. And I think in the context that it's given here, what it means is that Samuel didn't recognize God's voice. And if you read the rest of the sentence, it indicates that is Samuel didn't yet know the Lord, and the word of the Lord had not been revealed to him. So I think what it's saying is not that he didn't have any sort of relationship, but that he didn't recognize God's voice. And it was God's voice calling him. And that's why he kept going to Eli, going, "You called me." And Eli says, "I didn't call you. Go back to bed." And finally, in the 3rd cycle, Eli figured it out. He figured it out. And he said, it must be the Lord that's calling Samuel. Some of the commentators were kind of hard on Eli, saying he was just insensitive to the Lord. He should have recognized right away. And I think about this story and I think, I don't think I agree with that. I mean, the first time Samuel came to him was probably a total surprise. Like, you must have been dreaming. You must have heard something else. It wasn't me. And the second time Samuel came to him, it was probably just a little bit irritating. No, I didn't call you. And so I can see how, no matter how sensitive or insensitive Eli may have been to God's voice, how that could have easily happened. And so I'm not so hard on the guy as some of the commentators were. I think that's just a natural process. It takes that many cycles to figure something out for all of us. In fact, I wonder if Eli didn't half expect something like this to happen. He knew the prophecy that his sons would pass away, that God would replace them with someone else. He knew Samuel's devotion to the Lord. He knew Samuel's history. And I kind of wonder if he didn't half expect something like this to happen eventually, but maybe not so soon. And he was surprised by that. And so on this third cycle, he finally tells Samuel how to respond. He says, if it happens again, say, speak, Lord, for your servant hears. Active hearing. Some translations say, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening, which might get the idea across better to our English ears. And that's exactly what Samuel did. God came back a fourth time. He's persistent, by the way. He came back a fourth time, and he called out to Samuel, and Samuel said, speak, Lord, for your servant is listening. So that's the context and the calling of Samuel. I want you to see briefly the content of the message that God gave to Samuel. The content of the message is in verses 11 to 14. I think it's instructive that he didn't give this word directly to Eli, because I think that's an indication of where this whole story is going. Someone is growing up to replace you, and this is who it's going to be. This is who I'm giving my word to. And so I think that's instructive. But in verse 11, the very first verse of God's message, God says, I'm about to do a thing in Israel at which the two ears of anyone who hears it will tingle. Their ears will tingle. Isn't that a great expression? I mean, this is something significant that's going to happen, something that's going to surprise people, and they're going to be talking about it. Their ears will tingle. That phrase is used only two other times in the Old Testament, and both times it's God saying to a prophet that their ears will tingle when they hear this message, and in both the other cases, it's a message of destruction. It's a message of condemnation, and that is exactly what is happening here. In verse 12, God says to Samuel, I will fulfill against Eli all that I have spoken concerning his house from the beginning to the end. Tell Eli I'm going to fulfill everything that I've said about him. Now, I don't know if Samuel was aware of this prophet that had come earlier that we pointed out in chapter 2. I don't know if he knew that. If the prophet spoke privately to Eli, there's no reason Samuel would have. If the prophet spoke publicly, then he might have. We just don't know. But even if Samuel didn't know what that prophecy was, it's very clear that what he's talking about is punishment. Because the Lord says to him, I declare to Eli that I'm about to punish his house forever for the iniquity that he knew because his sons were blaspheming me. And so it's very clear to Samuel here what this is about. This is about condemnation. It's about punishment for Eli and his family. And then in verse 14, God says, I swear to the house of Eli that the iniquity of Eli's house shall not be atoned for by sacrifice or offering forever. The implication is Eli's house is done. The implication is someone else is going to replace them. Here's the priestly family, but someone else is going to step into that place. That's the implication that isn't said, but is pretty clear there. By the way, it doesn't specifically say Eli, and you'll see in a minute that he seemed to have a heart for God in spite of his failings, but it does say Eli's house, meaning his descendants. And so that's the content of the message. Now, the conclusion of the whole story then is in verses 15 to the end of the chapter. And there's a couple of things in that I want to point out. The first one is Samuel was afraid to tell Eli what the message was. I don't blame him. I mean, this was his mentor. This was kind of his adoptive father, if you will. This is the guy that raised him, that taught him about the things of the Lord. And yet he has to go to that man and give him a message of punishment, a message of condemnation. He was probably afraid to do that. And it says he was afraid to tell Eli the vision. I wonder if he was up the rest of the night just kind of worrying about, what am I going to say? How am I going to handle this situation? He may have been afraid, but Eli was certainly anxious to hear. In fact, the first thing Eli does is, well, what did he tell you? What did he tell you? And I wonder if he was up the rest of the night as well, anxious about what is this message? We haven't heard a message from God in a while. What is this message that God is bringing? I kind of wonder that if at this point Eli figured it out. At this point, he said, Samuel is the one God is raising up to replace my family. I think at this point, he probably had that figured out. And so it says that Samuel told him everything that the Lord had said in verse 18. And this is Eli's response. He is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. He's Yahweh. He's the self-existent, all-powerful God. Let him do what seems good to him. I think we see in that in spite of all his shortcomings, Eli had a respect for who God was. He still had that relationship with God and that trust in him. Even if it means my family, it's okay. He's good. He's going to do what is right. But the next line is, Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him. Samuel grew and the Lord was with him. Isn't that a great expression? That's the exact expression that's used of so many of the great saints that come in the Bible before Samuel. It's used of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. It's used of Moses and Joshua and Gideon. That same phrase, the Lord was with him. That's the exact same phrase that the author gives to Samuel. And we know from that Samuel's going to be one of these kind of people on the pages of God's history because God was with him. And then it says in verse 21 that the word of the Lord was no longer rare. That's where this chapter started. The word of the Lord was rare. It ends here. The word of the Lord is no longer rare. It says in verse 21, the Lord appeared again at Shiloh and revealed himself to Samuel by the word of the Lord. God's word is now coming on a more regular basis, and it's coming through this new prophet whose name is Samuel, this young man or even boy at that point. We don't know. But God is doing something new, and that's what it is. Well, that's the story. And again, it's a famous kid's story, and rightly so because possibly of Samuel's young age. But I want to bring it down to some lessons for us. And I just have two of them, but I want to deal at length with them. And the first one is this. We all have a calling. We all have a calling. God has a place of ministry for everyone. That is everyone who knows him. God has a place of ministry for everyone who knows him. So before we get started, that ministry is your purpose in life. And so before we go any further, I have to stop and say it's for those who know him. And you don't have a purpose in life if you don't know the one who created you, because he's the one that created you with that purpose. And that means that before you can ever know what your calling, your purpose is, you have to come to a place in your life where you recognize that you fall short of God's perfection. And that's why he sent his son, because you deserve death, separation from God because of that. And yet he sent his son Jesus to take that death on himself for us. And when you come to that realization, God's Spirit comes into you, and begins to lead you and guide you. And that's when you can begin to discover what your calling is. That's when you can discover what your purpose in life is. And so everyone who knows the Lord has that calling, has a place of ministry. It says in 1 Peter, we quoted this last week, as each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another. It says in 1 Corinthians 12, to each is given a manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. It says each of God's followers has a special ministry, and God will lead you to your place of ministry. We're doing a ministry fair at the end of February, and as Brittany told you a little bit ago, we're taking some of the weeks of February, starting next week, to introduce you to some of the ministries we do at Village, and just giving you an idea of what's out there. And you may, through that, discover that God has a place for you to minister. And so I hope you'll be open to what God might lead in that. But a couple of things about that. Number one, our calling is related to our spiritual gifts. Our calling is related to our spiritual gifts. Just like the verse we quoted in Peter, each one has a special gift. Use it to serve one another. And so we should discover, as Jesus followers, as Christian people, what our spiritual gifts are. And sometimes that's hard for people to do. But if you want to discover that, the first step is being open, just like Samuel was, to what God might lead into, where God might lead. And at some place you will find God's purposes and your spiritual gifts and the needs in the world meeting together. And that indicates where God's purpose, where God's calling for you is. But to begin with the whole spiritual gifts thing, there are ways to discover your spiritual gift. There are tests to do that with. Brittany has linked one on our website that looks like a pretty good one, and so you can find that there. By the way, spiritual gift tests are not definitive. Just because something comes out on a spiritual gift test doesn't mean it's your spiritual gift. It's a good indication it could be, and that's a good place to start. Another place to go is just, what do you desire to do? I mean, if you wanted to serve God, how would you like to do it? What's your desire to do? And sometimes that indicates maybe where your spiritual gift is going. Again, it's not definitive, but that's a beginning point. And if you begin to use your spiritual gift, God will be with you, just like he was with Samuel. He will be with you too when you exercise your gift. If it's your gift, you will begin to see an impact in lives. You'll see people's lives change because of it. Even if your gift is a behind-the-scenes gift like giving or service, those are kind of behind-the-scenes spiritual gifts, but you'll see lives change because of that. And remember that it's God who determines the spiritual gifts. We don't. We don't determine what gifts we have. God determines those gifts. It says in 1 Corinthians 12, God has placed the members, each one of them in the body as he desires. And it says a little later, he apportions to each as he wills, speaking of spiritual gifts. Samuel didn't choose to be a prophet. He didn't wake up one day and say, God, I want to be a prophet. And God just called him out of the blue, really. And that's often the case with many of us. We don't choose our gifts. They are gifts, and God is the giver. Imagine that. They're a gift. God gives them to us. We don't ask for them or demand them. And so it's God who determines those gifts. And when you use it, God will be with you. And when that happens, other people will confirm what your gift is. If you're really using your spiritual gift, it'll be having that impact. God will be using you and impacting lives for it. And people will tell you about it. It will be confirmed to you what that gift is. I skipped to verse 20 as I was walking through this chapter. It says, all Israel from Dan to Beersheba knew that Samuel was established as a prophet of the Lord. Dan is the furthest north tribe of Israel. Beersheba is the furthest south city of Israel. And so what they were saying is the entire nation recognized who Samuel was. They recognized that he was a prophet. And I think that's true when we're using our spiritual gifts. God is using us, and people will confirm that to us so that we'll really know it's our spiritual gift. And anyway, that should be happening. Carrie has told me she's had a lot of people tell her their spiritual gift is music. Music isn't listed as a spiritual gift in the Bible, but the way it's mentioned a lot of times in a lot of places, I think it is. I think it's just one that's not mentioned. And she says, I've had a lot of people tell me their spiritual gift is music, and it isn't. So there may be more to it than that, but if it really is your spiritual gift, people will confirm that to you. And so keep that in mind. That'll just help you understand as you're growing what your gift might be. Sometimes we discover our spiritual gifts just by plugging into something that sounds interesting and seeing the results. And so learn what your spiritual gift is and begin to use that. And as you do that, acknowledge the spiritual gifts of others. I mean, if God confirms to you for what others say, help others discover theirs too. If somebody does something in ministry that impacts your life, just let them know, hey, thanks for doing that. It really had an impact on me. And so that maybe is an encouragement with there. God has a place of ministry for everyone who knows him. But God calls some people to full-time ministry. God calls some people to full-time ministry. It's not all. In fact, if you look at the greatest names on the Old Testament, Abraham, Moses, and David, God called each one of them in a special way. But two of them had what you might call secular jobs. Moses was the only one that was in full-time ministry. David was a warrior, a shepherd, a king. And Abraham was a shepherd. I mean, they kind of had secular jobs, if you want to call them that. By the way, there's really no such thing as a secular job if you're a believer in Christ. What God calls you to is holy service. And that's what you should be doing. Now, it may not be full-time ministry, but it's still holy service because that's what God has called you to. And so there really is no such thing as a, quote, secular job, if by that you mean a job that isn't serving God. It may not be in full-time ministry, but it's still service to God. There's a story about King Henry III that he was getting tired of being king, and he was known as a fairly devout king, and so he went to the local prior and he said, I'm done being king, I want to join the monastery. And the local prior said, okay. He said, you know, joining a monastery means you have to be in complete obedience to me. And King Henry said, yeah, I know that. And the prior said, you sure you understand that? All your life, people have obeyed you. You've never had to obey anyone, and now you're going to have to obey me in everything. And King Henry said, I understand that. And so the prior said, then this is what you're supposed to do. Go back, get on your throne, and do what God has called you to do. And he understood that it's not just full-time ministry that God calls us to. It's other things that God calls us to. But I don't want to stop there because God does call some into full-time ministry. And we, as his people, need to be open to that possibility that he may be doing that. That's exactly what he did with Samuel. That's what he did with Moses and so on. God calls people sometimes into a full-time ministry. When he does, how do you know? He will be persistent. I just love the fact that it took 4 cycles for Samuel to finally respond to the Lord. And I think that tells us that when God has a place for you, he's going to insist. You're going to know because he's going to be persistent about that. And you're going to continually hear it. And by the way, you're never too young. Jeremiah was a boy when God called him to prophecy. Samuel, we don't know, again, how old he was, but he was young. You're never too young for God to call you into ministry. And you're never too old. Moses was 80, Abraham was 75, and God called them into ministry, into their life purpose. And so you're never too old, you're never too young. God has a place of ministry for everyone. But for some, he calls them into full-time service, and God will be persistent in that. I want to read a poem by a guy named Ed Ernie. This is simply, the name of this is The Call. The God of battle called, I heard the mounting cry of nations stirred. By homeland's honor and cannon's roar, the sight of death and the sound of war. Wave on wave they left our streets with muffled drum and marching feet, and mothers watched with reddened eye. Their hero sons led forth to die. The God of fortune beckoned bold. His outstretched hands bore gifts of gold. And eager youths with anxious eyes in frenzy leap to take that prize. And still they heed that siren voice and count it wise to make that choice. They grasp the wealth that fortune gave and beat their treasures to the grave. Come serve me, called the God of fame. 1,000,000 lips will bear your name. A nation at your shrine will bow, and monarch's laurel wreath your brow. Men honor long your memory, your name a fabled legacy. Sweet death if fame bestows her kiss. No fool, they say, who dies for this. Then down the span of centuries, I heard the man of Calvary. From blood-drenched hill with crosses high, he cried across a darkening sky. He spoke of continents in night, of blinded vision and blinded sight. His gentle voice is pained with woe. Whom shall I send? Who will go? My wage is not in gold or fame, in human honor or man's acclaim. I pay my wage in souls, you see. It's the coinage of eternity. But men still waste their waning day, and others wince and turn away. They murmur darkly at the cost, and they turn their faces from the cross. Oh God, mend our vision, touch our eyes, to clearly see the eternal prize. And consecrated let us be, and gladly yield ourselves to thee.